Welcome to Life in the Pit, a podcast about the lives and adventures of instrumentalists within the wonderful world of musical theater. And now, here is your host, David Lane.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is episode number 78. It's great to be with you once again. This is actually my first planned episode, at least as of about a month ago. But if you go back and listen to episode 77 and the follow-up 77A, you'll hear all about the news that came up and that I felt compelled to cover. Well, otherwise, this podcast has been dark for all of 2023. This is my first episode other than those two episodes since December of 2022. I'll explain a little bit more about kind of my plans for the podcast after my interview, but I just want to say I did not intend for it to be on sabbatical for quite this long, and I'm very excited for this opportunity to really, in my mind, to officially bring it back, and that is an interview with a Broadway musician talking about the pit. And in this case, I'm talking to a very recent Tony nominee, a 2023 Tony nominee for Best Orchestration, and that would be Dominic Fallacaro, who is a co-arranger as well as the music director for the also Tony-nominated musical that is currently on Broadway called And Juliet. And Juliet was a nominee for Best Musical, it was a nominee for Best Book, but it was also nominee for Best Orchestrations, and Dominic Fallacaro is one of those orchestrators. So And Juliet is what you would call a jukebox musical. The songs for the show are not written specifically for the musical, but they existed in pop culture prior to the musical, and the musical is tailored to these songs, which have been arranged in such a way. Well, there's an interesting component to that, though. It's not just random pop songs. They all happen to be the creative work of one songwriter named Max Martin. I'm going to be talking to Dominic about how Max Martin was involved with the show and also the whole process of coming up with these songs, the creative process, the collaboration, and of course, the work being done in the pit. We'll talk about the pit musicians. We'll talk about the evolution of the pit to get to its final product. One remarkable aspect about Dominic that you'll hear in this interview is that even though he is a Broadway arranger, orchestrator, and music director for the show, this is actually his very first Broadway work. Now, he's been a professional musician in other aspects of life, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But this is something, if you're aspiring to be in the pit and you're wondering, well, how much work do I have to do to get to such a status? Well, if you know the right people and you do the right work, perhaps not that much at all. So let's go ahead and get into it. Here is my conversation with Dominic Fallacaro. Oh, it's my pleasure today to be talking to Dominic Fallacaro. Dominic, thank you for taking time to chat with me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Dominic, just give us a little bit of an overview of what it is that you do, and what kind of projects are going on lately.
Sure. So I'm a producer, composer, multi-instrumentalist, but right now what my main focus is I'm the music director and provided orchestrations for And Juliet, which is now on Broadway.
Great. I always like to ask, there's several things I like to ask guests when they're on here, and the first one is, how did your music journey begin? You don't have to give us the novel version, but just kind of in general, how did you get into music? When did you realize this might be something you can do professionally, and when did theater enter your life?
So I started playing piano in kindergarten, and I think I still do it because I was never really forced to do it. I just sort of developed an enjoyment of sitting at the piano and bashing stuff out on it. I had really amazing piano teachers, which I owe a huge debt of gratitude to. And I started playing classical music, and in high school, I started to get more into jazz and pop music, and I wanted to be able to translate all the time I'd spent in piano to try and learn the stuff that I was listening to. And I got super into jazz music and pop music, and then began taking it seriously and went to study piano, jazz piano at the New School in New York. Mm-hmm. And so that really kind of developed the transition to being more interested in this professionally and trying to make a life out of it. And as far as theater, you know, it's interesting because in high school, I just kind of gobbled up any music that I possibly could. I played in any band, I did any choir, I did anything that was music, anything that I could possibly do that was music and not an academic class, I was full on board with. And so I did all of our high school musicals and stuff, South Pacific and other things. So I had like a toe dipped in it, but never like immersed myself in it. And so theater sort of came to me much, much later in New York. So I've been working on & Juliet since 2017, but it's the first theater thing that I've really been immersed in, and it's been fantastic to kind of see it all as a first time and kind of learn my way through it. It's been really, really fantastic.
So have you had any other roles in musicals in New York?
So nothing else for musicals, but coming to New York, I feel like I was always trying to gig as much as possible. I was, you know, playing in jazz groups with anyone that would have me. I was playing in other sort of bands. I remember it like just, you know, whether it's rock bands or other cover bands or just anything. I feel like something that was really important to me and still is, but the ability to say yes to a lot of things, because you never know where it takes you. I mean, & Juliet came into my life because I began making music with someone that was very passionate about children's music. And we had done a few records together. The third one that we did together won a Grammy in 2016. And through that, we started to write music for Sesame Street because Bill Sherman, the supervisor of Sesame Street, kind of noticed what we were up to. And then & Juliet was a project that had come into his stratosphere at that point. And then we sort of hit it off. And he brought me into the world of & Juliet. So you never know kind of what path leads to what thing, you know? It's so much chance and opportunity and just being prepared for it.
Yeah, that's a common thread, you know. I like that, you know, it sounds like, you know, you never had like theater, you know, as kind of like top priority. I've got to succeed in this arena, but it was all about music, and it was all about being open to opportunities.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I always loved the idea. I mean, like before I was in Broadway, anytime I encountered people that were immersed in kind of playing in pits and stuff, those were very like consummate musicians, because they would float from show to show, or if they were subbing on a bunch of stuff, just the ability to kind of like sponge music like that and that quickly is a real finesse kind of skill. So like if you're meeting musicians like that, they're at a certain caliber. So I always enjoyed kind of hearing about those kind of adventures and playing with those musicians, but it wasn't a particular focus of mine, and it's been an amazing thing an amazing community to become a part of. But it is one of the last sort of like bastions in New York City of like union musician work, and like it's a real pillar of like what musicianship can be.
Yeah. Let's talk about & Juliet. Yeah. So I have a few more questions that I'll ask you about your approach, but you mentioned Bill Sherman, and you and he are credited as the co-arrangers of this musical. So how do you dissect your roles, and are you all doing the same thing, and just kind of, you know, how would you describe what you do versus what he does?
So, I mean, shout out to Bill Sherman for even bringing me into this crazy universe. It's been amazing. And I think he, you know, We met on the set of Sesame Street when I was watching one of my songs get taped, and we just really hit it off. He asked what sort of things I'd been up to and what I was interested in, and for me it was pop music, pop production, working with artists and songwriters and developing that kind of stuff. And I told him, I was like, the real like top of Mount Olympus is Max Martin, those kind of folks. And he must have tucked that away. And we had drinks or dinner a few weeks later, and he asked would I be interested in working on And Juliet, with a musical with all the songs of Max Martin. And I, of course, was interested, but in the back of my head, I was like, I don't know if Max is going to show up. And then he called the next day and was like, let's have breakfast with Max tomorrow at this place and this time. So it became very real, very fast. And I think Bill and I from then have really found a simpatico creatively of, he is a master of 10,000 feet. He is, and was really helpful in sort of showing me the tools in my tool belt and how to use them for what works on stage. There were certain things that arrangements or things that we tried in early workshops where immediately like his smell test for what would work or what served the story or kind of what would get applause or what sort of things would work in the context of a narrative, he immediately had a sense of what was going on. And then from there, it's the two of us sitting by a piano and kind of bashing stuff out and me playing options and him sort of going through them. And we're always sort of tag team side by side at a piano. And then when it comes to the arranging and the orchestrating, it's so wild because you don't want to do, there's so much work to be done, but you don't want to front load it too much because when you're in the workshop stage or rehearsal stage, entire songs can come and go. So you want to arrange 3 songs for a whole bunch of musicians that end up leaving. So you end up doing this pretty late in the process. You're like in your later stage of rehearsals. So, I mean, that period of time is crazy because Bill and I are in rehearsals and then you sort of like, once they're, rehearsing choreography for a number, you run out. We have like another room with a keyboard and our whole finale set up. And then you're trying to get as much work done before you're summoned back into to the other room. So it's always sort of a side-by-side process of both stuff that happens around a piano with actors. There are certain things that get worked out kind of in a workshop mode. And then there are certain things that sort of we take and handle ourselves and kind of present. One of the coolest things about this process and one of the most amazing things about kind of working with Max and having a musician as sort of the top creative of a show is the fact that they put so much both faith in us to work on it and gave us so much kind of runway to try stuff. At the early part of this, we were able to do a music lab where we were able to be to show Max kind of what we were up to. Like we orchestrated the first, handful of the songs in the show, and then Roar, one of our big numbers in the show. We brought a band into a studio for a whole week. Bill and I were able to really like try stuff with our orchestrations and see how it translated with our size band, and then bring Max in on the last day and kind of ask him what he thought and then get his feedback in real time before we orchestrated the rest of the 20 songs in the show. So that was also supremely helpful in the process.
Right. Great. So I'm going to come back to, of course, the orchestration in the pit just for a moment, but I didn't know till yesterday about Max Martin and this show. I listened to the cast recording. I haven't been to New York in I guess 5 years now, so I haven't seen any of the shows that are current, and I actually just coincidentally. But before I knew that you were going to come on the show, maybe a week before was the first time I heard of this show, And Juliet. Mm-hmm. So I had a friend that was posting pictures of going to see the show and all that. And first thing that came to my mind is I don't know how many listeners have seen the movie. And got to keep in mind, this is before I listened to the recording or saw the show, but I saw it's a new take on on Juliet, and it had pop music. I don't know if you know the movie Hot Fuzz. It's with.
I'm familiar. I've never seen it though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's a action comedy mystery, but a whole lot of comedy in it. Mm-hmm. And there's an amateur production of Romeo and Juliet, and intentionally really bad acting, and it ends with the whole cast singing "Love Fool," the "Love Me, Love Me."
Cardigan.
And when I heard the pop songs mixed in there, I was like, I hope this is better. And
I'd like to think so, selfishly.
And it's again, having not seen the show, just heard the cast recording, and it's quite a bit better. And my first thought was, it's interesting that you kind of chose songs from a particular time period, but they all seem to go together. And then I didn't realize until I read, these are all by the same person. I was kind of ignorant of how. Yeah, I mean, I've heard the name Max Martin before, but I was ignorant of how extensive his footprint has been in the world of pop music.
Yeah, it's pretty phenomenal. I mean, to have your finger on the pulse for that long,
right?
Some people, it's rarefied air to just have one number one song, and then to like smash after smash over decades is pretty wild,
right?
And the fact that the Backstreet Boys sound very different than Katy Perry, sounds very different than Celine Dion, sounds very different than Ariana Grande and The Weeknd, but Max and his love for melody and just his love for like shaping and developing an artist and kind of finding their vision. I mean, that's sort of the common thread through it. And yeah, it's an embarrassment of riches, the catalog. And it's also really cool for the show that we were able to pick sort of the things that serve the story the best, as opposed to just like, there are 5 songs and we really got to milk them because that's all people will know. I mean, we have such an amazing luxury that like some of the songs that we picked are the biggest songs in the universe, from Baby One More Time to I Want It That Way to Roar, things that were like the mega. But we also have stuff,
Hey, slow it down. What do you want from me?
And songs that are still hits, but kind of lesser known ones. And it's just, we were able to kind of, over time, pick things that worked in the story the best. And again, shout out to David West Reed, the writer, for being so clever to kind of thread these together. And also for, the sort of the common link that Shakespeare was pop of that time. It was meant for mainstream audiences, and I think it's history that sort of elevates it over time, and rightly so. But it's the same sort of thing about pop music, that like it can seem surface level, it can seem pedestrian in a lot of ways, but if you dive in and if you really explore what it takes to like make a hit, there is some absolute artistry behind it. And it's a testament to Max that the amount of detail that gets poured into these that makes them hits. And so there's kind of a parallel between these two forces that kind of are making art for the masses, and kind of how it shapes culture over a long period of time. So the idea of Shakespeare being pop, the idea of Max being the Shakespeare of this generation, and kind of seeing what happens from there.
There's definitely a high degree of relatability with, someone like Max. So he's had by any measure, a very high degree of success. But at the same time, if I was to just randomly quote some say to people in the street, if I said, Baby One More Time, I Want It That Way, if I was just to name some of the songs in the show, I'm sure that they would say Britney Spears, Backstreet Boys, Katy Perry. And if I asked them who wrote the music, I bet a lot of them would probably say, well, they wrote it. Because especially, I'm Gen X, and I grew up in the era of, bands writing their own music, which is it's actually an interesting pocket of music history, because it fits in between times where songwriters did a lot of work. Because if you go, Frank Sinatra didn't write his own songs, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
And, most of your pop singers today, actually, some like Taylor Swift's kind of a notable exception. She writes her own songs, but most of your big hits are written by somebody. So kind of like a pit musician, kind of like the arranger and orchestrator of a musical rather than the composer. You're doing a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of major creative work but you're not always seen. You may be working with some popular things like Sesame Street and Juliet, but I mean, now correct me if I'm wrong, you probably are okay to go in a restaurant without being hounded by people wanting your autograph.
Yeah, believe it or not, that's possible.
Yeah.
I can still enjoy uninterrupted lunch these days, yes.
Right. So obviously you guys collaborated to choose the songs that you wanted, and I assume that collaboration was with the book writer, because the book writer is probably incorporating the script, and well, you can't really incorporate the script into the songs. You can incorporate the songs into the script, because the song's lyrics are done and so forth. But I imagine, then you have to decide. So one of the things that I like about the cast recording is that I can tell that you guys have made some harmonic choices, as well as, of course, a fixed instrumentation that makes it sound like it comes from the same musical, So if for some reason I'd lived under a rock for the last 20 years and I didn't know these songs and I didn't read the credits, I might think that they were original songs for the musical. Mm-hmm. So I, after you chosen the songs, I'm sure that may have been the easy part. So what are some decisions that you made early on? Like, when did you maybe give us a history of the Pit? Like, obviously, I assume you started piano only, just to get things going. But how did that develop? Like, was it bigger before you arrived at your final number, or was it smaller and then you added to it? Just what's the history of the instrumentation?
Yeah, of course. So I think it was always important to us early on of like fusing the world of pop that lives inside a computer, mostly, of like whether it's synthesizers or other sort of drum machines, stuff that's like so finely crafted, but with the dynamics of live musicians and kind of putting it into a setting where human beings can execute it. And we always early on, Bill and I were thinking about like what little things can kind of tie you to the period, at least even just subliminally. And we began, there's like little moments of harpsichord, and then we really, and nylon guitar and other things like that. But very quickly we realized that a nucleus that could tie us through is the...
You're not that innocent.
Because it can give us an extra like orchestral layer even when we're at our most pop moments. Like it can give us our most like, I don't know, like Live and Let Die, like just epic kind of sound, but then it can give us our most like balladesque and like legit kind of sound as well. And to me, the whole show is kind of oscillating between our very like narrative and theater driven stuff, and then the like gut punch nostalgia. This is exactly how you know this song. I think one of the most amazing things about this show is that it's not just done with like the blessing of Max, but Max being directly involved. One of the coolest things in the universe was early on getting sent all the stems and all the multi-tracks of everything. So when we do certain songs, when we start It's My Life by Bon Jovi, it's not just sort of kind of the talk box sound that's the iconic opening riff. It's the exact one. It is. And whether that's a snare drum, whether that's a synthesizer, whether that's other stuff, we have access to the vault. And then the next step is kind of channeling that through how we execute it through our musicians. The size of the band is 9. It's a rock band plus a string quartet. Okay. And so we kind of like are able to use permutations of these things and then everyone at once in a lot of different ways. That sometimes it is a drummer playing samples on an SPD because it needs to be these exact sounds that come through. And then sometimes it's drum sets. Sometimes it is piano-driven kind of things, and then sometimes I'm playing a synth, I'm playing an organ, I'm playing other things that come through, and yeah, it's all about sort of channeling those things. I think in our initial music lab, we had 11 because we had an extra guitarist and a percussionist, but then I believe it was the size of the theater in London that had us go to 9, and so it was a slight restructure for a couple songs for 9, but then it was a real sweet spot for us to orchestrate for that, because it was very easy to think about it of rock band, string quartet, and how we kind of use those flavors throughout.
So string quartet, 2 violins, viola, cello, and 2 keyboards and 1 guitar. Is that what you ultimately had?
2 keyboards, 1 guitar, bass with synthesizer, drums with SPD, and we have an absolutely incredible band that's slaying this night after night.
Right. And it sounds like, just listening to the cast recording, just trying to imagine this being executed live, I assume that you in addition to playing, notes live, it sounds like probably at least one, but maybe both keyboardists, you probably have some key triggering going on, some Ableton or something similar to that.
Yeah, so there's sort of a hodgepodge of certain different things. There is a little bit of key triggering business for keys too, for a couple max kind of splashes of things. But then, we're living in pop land, so like Ableton is a big part of things, and just even in stuff that doesn't have a lot of density of tracks or anything like that, like just staying on click and kind of maintaining the there's certain things that kind of need the rigidity of the click to translate. For our ballads in the show, we are off click. We are the band that we are. And there's plenty of songs in the show that breathe and have flex, but when we're 4 on the floor, when we're really, really doing it, Ableton is live. And it's about like the drums are still playing drum sounds, but it is those like little kind of what I call like pixie dust of other things that kind of surround it, and that stuff lives on the track. The stuff that's like risers and whooshes that get you towards downbeats or impacts on downbeats, and other sort of like things that are very time specific and sound specific kind of live there. But it's all sort of things that fuse together, but it is our band crushing it all the time as the main nucleus of everything.
Right. As I was listening to these songs, and now I'm again Gen X, so some of these songs were more familiar to me than than some of the ones that I before I stopped listening to the radio, I guess you could say. But I felt like they were all kind of familiar. But the ones I recognized the most, I really liked some of the harmonic choices that you all made. You did a lot of like chord substitutions, and so forth. And this I don't want to get into like overly technical theory, for this particular podcast, but how much of that was you, how much of it was Bill, and how much of it was Max, in terms of like just kind of coming up with some inventive ways to retell it in a harmonic language. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think I can't help it with a background in jazz and loving expensive chords, and got to sneak a few in there if it's musically possible. But it all has to kind of serve the melody, and I think the best barometer of that is Max. And so we played him stuff, and there was a lot of stuff he liked, and then he was very helpful about other things. I mean, I think the biggest thing is we didn't change melodies. We didn't change the thread of the melody. The only notable exception to that is the song Problem in Act 2, which the chorus of that song is usually a whisper. It's like a kind of chanted whisper, and that kind of thing. Again, credit to Bill. He knew that would kind of die on the vine on stage. That like whispering, by and large, just wouldn't translate. Like if you did that a 1-to-1 translation, that would not feel exciting on the stage. So we needed to melodicize that, and so he came in with a melodization of what that hook could be, and then again, it's kind of like us passing a quick volleying of ideas back and forth, and how we do that. And I think there are different things. It's almost tough to tell in the soup of who started certain things, but like Problem definitely.
One less problem without you. I got one less problem without you.
I think other chord stuff, I would be inclined to say if there's a sneaky chord in there, that's me at the piano kind of sneaking that in through workshops and seeing if it stays.
Yeah.
It's also just, pop music is by its nature, and I don't say this with any disrespect, or there's no slander with it. Pop music is repetitive. That is the crux of pop music, is sort of like earworming its way into your brain and your heart and all the things. But theater, by its nature, repetition is tough. You don't want to necessarily come back to the same exact thing. And if you do, you need to be able to say it kind of a different way, or it needs to mean a different thing. And so I think a lot of the times that you hear different harmonic language, if you hear other kind of orchestrational zhuzhes, as it were, that's because if we're returning to the chorus, what can we do to kind of lift it? What can we do to kind of change it? If it's Baby One More Time, that we kind of keep it in this, it's a very minor song, and we decide it's Juliet's I Want in the piece, and how can we make it its most emotionally driven thing? And so we try to give this cinematic kind of rise to it. The chords kind of walk up through a lot of the choruses. That's stuff that the harmonics are mostly ish the same, but bass motion is, and just little things that we can do to kind of tweak as we come back to themes and melodies.
Yeah, and all these things that you're saying, it's justification for why you don't just license all the songs and play them at specific points.
Yeah.
It's kind of it's the kind of my background is more, in terms of what I'm more familiar with is film. I love film scoring, and, that's part of the art of it is twisting and shaping the music around what's going on in that case on screen, but in this case on stage. So yeah, I mean that's exactly what
yeah you're doing. And I mean it's such a long period of time between certain songs that the sonics even of the original would be so different. If you hit play on Baby One More Time and then play on Roar back to back, just even the difference in the language of programmed drums has changed so much in that time. And Max has evolved, the sound has evolved mostly because he changes it with everything that he does, and he changes the landscape with everything that he does. Right. But the thread that our musicians and having a band gives us the ability to kind of walk quickly between decades, and I again watching people watch it, and I love that certain folks in the show could be much more familiar with certain periods of Max, and really the early Britney and the boy band era could be on more people's radar, but then less familiar. It's amazing to watch families come where it could be the parents had the boy band posters on the wall and the kids know Katy Perry, and that there's that much time between. But I also love watching people that the music doesn't come for free at all, that they have no connection with it. When older folks come and they're just watching it to watch it, and the music has to stand on its own. It has to just be a cohesive score, and I think that was part of the impetus. I mean, I there was never any doubt about having live musicians, and that's just the testament to them of how credible can you make this piece. And yeah, having a amazing band is the linchpin of that.
Well, I definitely want to come back to the band just a moment, but I want to chase one more thread or go back to one previous thread before I forget. And that is just, we talked about you have keyboard triggers, and that's just programming the computer and kind of mapping out that, because I've only had one 2-part episode on this podcast, and it was all about keyboard programming because it's such a sophisticated thing. I mean, we have MainStage, we have technology to help, but I haven't asked anybody who's arranged before planning that out. You have to plan how many sounds you're going to use, how much time you have to switch with, which with MainStage, you really don't need very long. or something like that. If you've got a foot pedal, you're usually good to go, and you can layer things and so forth. But whose job did that fall to map out the keyboard parts, and was it the same person that had to program the keyboards for the show?
Yeah, I mean, shout out to Fidge Adams, shout out to Randy Cohen. Fidge was the initial programmer in London, so this piece started out in London. And when Bill and I were orchestrating, we were sending scores to Fidge, who is the keyboard programmer. And he was translating, there were certain things that directly referenced the original songs, and then it's like, can you match this? And then there are certain things where, like, Bill and I, if you combed through our score, the sort of names of pianos and pads and other things get kind of hilarious names as they end up going on. And he did a fantastic job of just translating kind of what we were thinking for whether it's a pad, whether it's an organ, whether it's a synthesizer lead. So Keys 1, my setup, has a Nord stage in front of me, and it's mostly piano driven with a few notable organ and pad and other sort of exceptions or other kind of layered exceptions. But Keys 2, that chair is monstrous, and shout out to Haley Bennett for wrangling it and anyone who's come in to play that chair. That kind of oscillates between being responsible for playing certain samples, like whether it's a talk box of It's My Life, whether it's other sort of iconic things that need to be triggered from the keys, but also like sonic kind of glue of organs and pads and other kind of polysynths. That rig has an 88 key controller on the bottom and a Prophet synthesizer on top. So we're like actually using analog synthesis as well. And again, I mean, the luxury of this thing is that we're working on this show with Max, who remembers the synthesizer presets, who remembers all the patches from everything. And so when the Juno patch is not right, he comes in and is able to tweak the knobs or able to kind of come in and help tweak things. But Fidge did the initial programming and the handling of stuff, and then Randy has handled it in New York. And it's a lot. Keys 2 is a very dense chair of multiple patch switches and so many layers. My chair is slightly more piano driven, so I can be a little more heads up and conduct the show at the same time, and just be a little bit more mindful of like being present with the actors and stuff, that I'm not constantly patch switching quite as much during all of it, because I'm also firing Ableton, so there's a lot of kind of all limbs octopus all the time. So my chair is a little more piano heavy.
Okay, you just mentioned Haley Bennett, on Keys 2, yourself on Keys 1. It is life in the pit. I like to acknowledge the pit. So let's name, who's your other principals that are playing this show night after night with you?
Of course, Sam Merrick on the drums, Mike Bono playing the guitar, Alex Eckert playing the bass and the synth bass, MJ Still playing our concertmaster, Violin 1, Marina Im, Violin 2, Ina Paris on viola, Adele Stein on cello. It's an embarrassingly talented band.
Great. So I hope those, this audience is, I don't have a 100% clear picture of it, but I do know a lot of pit musicians listen to this, so they're of course appreciative of that. But I do think I have a lot of fans that are just theater fans, and
sure.
This is really good to hear about it. So I'll just encourage all of you, take notice of the pit. Next time you should go to the show, because it's really good. So I guess one last question
Sure.
that I did want to ask. I know that cast recordings, sometimes happen fairly early in the process, sometimes a little bit later, but what's changed about the show? What, are there things you did specifically for the cast recording that maybe got modified for the final product?
Yeah, I'm sure there's various things that kind of fall into that category. I mean, by and large, it's the same, because we were well into tech, I want to say, or at least the later part of rehearsals when we were in London. So the show was mostly the show. And then, we made a cast recording in London, and then we made another cast recording in New York. So again, it's there's even subtle changes, UK to US, just a little bit of arrangement tweaks and a little bit of, learning lessons from the UK, bringing them to the US. It's tough to bring music that is so flexible night after night into a studio setting, which needs to be like, you need to lock it in. I'm thinking of one of our big ballads, That's the Way It Is, that happens in Act 2, sung by Betsy Wolfe, who's amazing. And the ending of that song, most of the song is tempo, but the end is very rubato and has a big stop in the middle. And so figuring out how to execute those sort of things in a studio context was its own sort of set of challenges. And we also, a lot of cast recordings get done, kind of the band all sits there, they play it over a couple of days, they pick the best take, and that's about it. And then the vocals get laid on top. But in the world of Max, that's not possible. You need to put much more magnifying glass on stuff, and it's a luxury. It's an amazing luxury to have. So we're tracking rhythm section first, we're adding other things, we're tracking the strings by themselves, we're really like fine-tooth comb everything, and everything from the way, the microphones that are placed on it. And again, our amazing engineer, Michael Ilber, is like very detailed with everything. So there's so much care given to it, but that level of detail presents its own sort of challenges in executing it over the course of many weeks, as opposed to just, we all just played together once. But as far as arrangements that changed, I think it's a little bit more of, there are certain songs that in the show don't button. We don't get applause, and we kind of transition into underscore or other things. But on a record, that would be pretty underwhelming. So we tend to button things up on the cast recording and just make sure that things have endings, and kind of translate the best that they could on a recording.
All of that is wonderful. I know if this was like, a Tim Ferriss style podcast or Joe Rogan or someone, we could go 2.5, 3 hours. I know there's several threads we didn't cover. Like, you, of course, work with the actors, and that's its own conversation. And I know that you've got a great cast. And the one observation I just make, and I don't know if someone's pointed this out to you, but your kind of relative lack of professional theater experience, it's probably proven an asset in the creative aspect of the show, because I think, a lot of times you get into kind of an echo chamber when it comes to creativity, and you were able to bring kind of, and plus, having Max, you're bringing this true pop influence into the theater, which I think is one of the really attractive aspects of the creation.
I think theater has been a really interesting form to learn. I've done these jobs separately. I've worked with a vocalist. I have shaped a performance in a studio. I've led a band. I've done all sorts of these jobs separately, but theater is about those things all fire in tandem, all at the same time. It's juggling, giving notes to actors and maintaining performance there, and then still playing the show with the musicians. It's a sort of a wearing all hats all the time kind of thing. But I think coming from the outside, it was, I like to think that I was helpful, because the music director of the show needed to be someone that could open up Pro Tools and chop stuff up from the stems, and also deal with finale. And I think a lot of some of those things live apart, and this show sort of swirls all those universes together of stuff in the studio landscape, and then stuff that appears as dots and dashes on a page. And so those two things are much closer together in our show. And I think my job is to marry those constantly.
Right. I know I'm 4 questions past when I said last question, but it just occurred to me, talked about all the stuff that you have to do. So what happens when on your nights off? Does Haley associate conduct, or does she move to your chair and someone subs for her? Is that how that works?
Exactly. Haley is the associate, and so part of my job is giving notes on a regular basis. So I'll step out into the front of the house. I'll listen at the sound booth. I'll take notes. Whether it's noting musicians, whether it's noting the actors, that's a big part of the job. And so she will play a lot of those shows, but we also have many talented subs that come in and do it. It's really, that's one of the most amazing things to kind of learn about Broadway, is not only the musician, we're so lucky to have the musicians that we have in our pit on a regular basis, but then also meeting the folks that can just kind of come in, and they're playing on 3 other shows at the same time, and they still come in and give such a detailed and great performance on this. It's a really fantastic thing to kind of watch and kind of see happen in real time. It's really amazing.
Right. Okay, so these will literally be the last 2 questions that I have for you today.
Right.
So the first one is, do you have any other projects going on that you can chat about when you're not doing And Juliet?
Sure. I'm sort of just coming up for air a little bit now that we're still in the throes of Tony season, which is really amazing. And we announced a tour that we're going around the country at the end of next year, and we're in Australia. So there's been 100 different things for just And Juliet. But I'm starting to work with new theater artists that I'm excited about, and those things are a little too early to talk about. Okay. I also have a musical that I have written the music for, along with a fantastic co-composer and writer, Andrea Daly, and that's in its very, very early stages. But yeah, all exciting things that are in their very seedling kind of stage, and so we'll see how things develop.
Okay, great. And the last question is, where can people follow you if they want to, see when these things come about, what's going on?
Sure. So I still keep a Twitter active at Key of Dom on Twitter. And other than that, come to the Sondheim, come see And Juliet, say hi, say hi afterwards. I have a website. There's a contact form there if you did want to reach out. But yeah, pretty easy to find both digitally and in person these days. Okay,
great. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you about just the whole creative process and getting to know you. So thank you for coming on board today.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
And that's going to wrap up episode 78. I greatly appreciate Dominic for joining me today, and just want to say thank him for that. And if you're still with me, and you've been listening to Life in the Pit in a while, just want to chat just for a little bit to just catch you up to speed about what's been going on with the podcast. I said a little bit in the last bonus episode of, mainly what's been going on is my other podcast, The Musician Toolkit. It's going very well. It's keeping me very busy, and I've been finding ways to get ahead on it. And I've finally gotten a few weeks ahead to where I think every now and then I can piece together an episode for Life in the Pit to keep it going. If you go back to last year and listen to episodes number 75 that I did about called Dare to be Seen, that was an episode that really wasn't about the pit itself. And I said that that's the type of episode that you're more likely to find on the Musician Toolkit podcast. So that when I do Life in the Pit episodes from that point going forward, it was going to be very focused and strictly about the pit, or very closely related as much as possible. And so I do have a few guests that I'm going to try to get in touch with to come on every so often, but I still can't tell you what kind of schedule to expect. I would say, this is the 3rd episode for the month of June, after having no episodes at all for the month of January through May. So that just shows you that it's not very consistent at the moment. In my ideal world, I would still try to get you a new episode every month if I could, but try not to go more than 2 months without a new episode. That's the bad news if you really enjoy new content of this type. But the good news is I'm going to do my best to make sure that they are interviews like today, and that they have everything to do with playing in the pit and theater. If you know of interesting guests that would love to come on and chat with me, feel free to send me a message. And you can do that as a DM on the social media links that I'll give at the very end of this episode, or through my website at lifeinthepitpod.com. As of right now, I do not have a plan for episode 79, but I'm going to see how things go. At the same time, I do say, if you have not checked out the Musician Toolkit, I do think it is a podcast that, if I was to just estimate with no mathematical accuracy at all, I would be willing to say that at least 90% of you would love it. So if you haven't checked it out, that one is active every week. A lot of the same concepts of musicianship we're talking about is being talked about over there. And in fact, it was this podcast that inspired the other one. It was things that pit musicians kept telling me was important as tools of their trade, basically, that helped them to become the type of musician that could get this type of job. That's what we talk about over there. So anyways, that's all that I will do as far as pitching that podcast. As far as this one, keep following. It's not done. It's just going to be very slow from here on out. There may come a time that I'll actually pick up the frequency, but there also may be, like there was to begin this year, a few months at a time where there are no new episodes. But if you'll just please keep following and, keep checking your feed every so often and just see if there's a new episode, and I will let you know when one drops, especially on the Instagram and Facebook pages. And that segues nicely into the end of this episode. So as a reminder, if you want to follow what's coming up next, be sure to follow the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Life in the Pit Pod. And you can follow me on Instagram at David Lane Music, or Twitter and Facebook at David M. Lane Music. There's also a TikTok at David Lane Music. As always, a special thanks to Mark Perullo for his cover art and to Bill Cisna for providing the introduction to this podcast. The theme music is composed and performed by David Lane. You can subscribe, find out more about the podcast, or leave feedback through lifeinthepitpod.com. Please rate and review on the Apple Podcast app or Spotify, and please share with your friends. Thank you for listening.